Hi, Armindo Fontana here from York English Services. It is my pleasure to introduce you to another PowerPoint presentation on the CELBAN speaking exam. Today we're going to talk about role play number 3. But before we continue, I just want to remind you that even though, it makes me happy to provide this information with you, even though it's extremely important to get as much information as possible in order to prepare yourself to complete role play number 3 in a satisfactory manner, it's not enough. You still need to practice, practice, practice a lot. And equally, or even more importantly, is to get proper feedback. And here, I want to highly encourage you to not rely on feedback from friends or from other nurses who have taken the CELBAN exam before. I think you should seek the assistance of a trained professional, someone like me who has the experience, who has expertise in this field, who has helped many students complete successfully role play number 3 and pass the CELBAN exam. So I think, considering how important this is for you, that you should listen to my advice and seek help. And I'm here. York English Services is here to help. So I'm leaving below information about my website and also about the WhatsApp number and or email address you can use to contact me. And I want to let you know in advance that it will be a pleasure to help you. Okay? So let's start talking about role play number 3. In role play number 3, you will play the role of a nurse, and the assessor will play the role of another nurse who has a problem. In role play number 3, you have to give advice to the nurse who is struggling with a particular issue. This is what role play number 3 is all about. In order to successfully complete role play number 3, you need to take 3 steps. First, use different formulas to give advice. Second, provide advice relevant to the situation. And finally, pay attention to the criteria for evaluation. Armindo, I don't understand. Calm down, relax. I'm going to explain to you every single one of these different steps. Ready? Here we go. The first step is use different formulas to give advice. Even before you begin, the assessor will share a few words with you. He or she, the assessor, will give you a few instructions regarding role play number 3 and will most likely describe the scenario in which role play number 3 takes place. So listen carefully to the instructions. Pay special attention to the following words. To when the assessor says something like, don't read the instructions. Instead, explain them and make sure they have been understood by the patient. This is the essence of role play number 3. You should not look like or sound like you are just merely reading the instructions to the patient. So that's why it's important to use different formulas to give advice in different ways. And I'm going to talk to you about 6 different options you have when you need to provide advice, to offer advice to this other nurse who is struggling with a particular problem. The first formula is I suggest, I recommend, I advise you do this. Okay, so please pay attention to the form of the verb. You do. Okay, students like to say I suggest you should do or I recommend you to do. Both are incorrect. You should say I suggest, I recommend, I advise you do something. I suggest you talk to the head nurse. I recommend you ask the patient why he or she is behaving this way. I advise you to invite another professional to come and talk to the patient. I suggest, I recommend, I advise you do. You talk, you listen, you read, you do something. The second formula is if I were you, I would do this or that. If I were you, I would talk to the head nurse. If I were you, I would ask the patient why he doesn't want to take his medication. If I were you, I would do something. I just want to emphasize at this point that formulas 1 and 2 are quite elegant. So if I were you, I would make sure I would use formulas 1 and 2. But there are other formulas you can use. You can use formula number 3. Here we're talking about the classic you should, you could do something. You should talk to his family to find out if they know why the patient is behaving this particular way. In my opinion, you could approach the charge nurse and see if she can help you in any way. You should, you could do this or that. The next formula is, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you approach the head nurse to see why she is treating you so in such a mean way? Why don't you ask the family members to come and talk to the patient? Why don't you do this or that? Formula number 5 is a little different. Have you tried doing this or that? Have you tried talking to the head nurse? Have you tried asking the patient why he's behaving this particular way? Have you tried doing something? A final formula is, how about doing this or that? How about asking a psychologist to come and talk to the patient? How about asking the social worker for advice? How about doing this or that? So I have just shared with you 6 formulas, 6 different ways you can give advice. Why so many? Because most likely the assessor who is playing the role of the nurse who has a problem will say, after you give a piece of advice, he or she, the assessor, will say something like, well, I tried this, but it didn't really work. Do you have any other advice for me? What else can I do? Then you have to give a second piece of advice. Um, you should be prepared to give at least 3 different pieces of advice, most likely 4. Who knows, maybe even 5 if the assessor is having a bad day, or if he or she's not sure you know what you're talking about, you know what you're doing. So you should be ready to give 3, 4, 5 different pieces of advice. That's why it's important that you know by heart the 6 different ways you can share, you can offer advice to someone who has a problem, which is basically the essence of role play number 3. The second key step you need to take is provide advice relevant to the situation. Now, keep in mind that you are not being assessed on your ability to provide the ideal advice, that you're not going to be judged based on your ability to provide the most suitable advice possible. They are evaluating your language skills, and in this case, your speaking skills, your ability to communicate, to express your ideas in good English. However, try to make sure that you provide advice that is connected to the scenario, um, which is, you know, um, the scenario of role play number 3. Okay, so of course you should try to give advice that is, suitable, good advice. What kind of advice? Well, let me share with you a few different pieces of advice that I believe work in all, or at least in most situations. Ready? The first kind of advice you can give is ask the patient or the person you're having problems with, usually is the patient, why the problem is occurring. So, for example, you can suggest to the nurse who has a problem, have you tried asking the patient why he refuses to eat his meals? Have you asked the charge nurse why she's giving you so many different kind of tasks that are not really related to your position? So that's one kind of advice that you can give to the nurse. Have you tried asking the person you are having problems with why the problem is occurring? Clear? Great. Let's move to advice number 2. The second kind of advice you can give is why don't you obtain help from a coworker, the charge nurse, a physiotherapist, a psychologist, a social worker, a nutritionist, a different kind of healthcare professional, or someone who works at the hospital, could be, a member of the human resources department, for example. So, in this case, the advice would sound like this. If I were you, I would approach the head nurse and ask her to come and talk to the patient to see if she can if she can have better results. Another example, why don't you ask another nurse, a coworker, to come and talk to the patient? Why don't you come and talk to the psychologist and ask him to come and visit the patient and explain the importance of coming to therapy sessions? So that's a different advice you can give to someone. No, just advise the person to get help from somebody else. A third piece of advice you can give is ask someone for advice. Have you tried approaching the charge nurse to ask for advice? I suggest you talk to the head nurse. I'm pretty sure she's very experienced and she's going to be more than willing and glad to provide solid advice for this kind of problem. So you can suggest that the person ask someone for advice. Fourth, you can suggest to the nurse, to the assessor who is playing the role of a nurse, that he or she can invite the patient's family to help. So you can say something like, if I were you, I would invite the patient's family to talk to the patient and try to convince him to take his medication. Relevant advice number 5 is a little bit less than ideal, let's say. I understand that. But it is a possibility in case you run out of ideas. You can always say, I think you should ask to be transferred. So that's an advice you can give to the nurse who is struggling with a difficult situation. I think you should ask to be transferred to a different unit or different department because it seems to me like you have been struggling too much and for too long. So it might be time to try to something different. Remember, you're not, I know that this is not the ideal kind of advice, but remember that you are not being evaluated on your ability to provide good suggestions. They are assessing your language skills. So students sometimes tend to panic when they cannot think about anything they could say. So this is definitely an option. Finally, finally, you can also suggest that the nurse, the assessor who is playing the role of a nurse, should accept the fact that nothing can be done. Again, this is far from ideal piece of advice, but it is a possibility. And so it is something that you can resort to if you're struggling to find ideas to share uh, with this nurse who has some kind of trouble, who is in some kind of trouble. So you can say something, I don't know, but it seems to me that the best option in this case is just to accept the fact that your coworkers is difficult and nobody will be able to change her. Nobody will be able to change that. So if I were you, I would just focus on your tasks and forget about her. So this is another possibility, which I admit is far from perfect, but it is an option that can save you in case you are running out of ideas and uh, and you are hesitating or you feel like pausing while you try to complete role play number 3. The final key step you need to take in order to complete role play number 3 satisfactorily is pay attention to the evaluation criteria. I talked about this when I created a PowerPoint presentation on role play number 2. So here I'm going to briefly describe these criteria for you because you have to remember role play number 3 is also part of a speaking exam. They are assessing your ability to express yourself, to communicate in English, in good English. So, in all the other criteria, all the criteria they use to assess you during the other parts of the speaking exam will be used here to evaluate how good your English is. So let's talk about these different criteria quickly. The first criteria is initiative and confidence. So you need to show, to demonstrate to the assessor that you feel comfortable operating in an English speaking environment. So it's important that you take initiative and that you show confidence. So don't wait for the assessor to tell you when to start role play number 3. Don't ask for permission. When you are ready, you just say, I'm ready to start role play number 3. And then you just start. Hi, John, how are you? The second criteria is intelligibility. Here you are being assessed on your ability to communicate in a way that they can understand you. This is the most important factor they pay attention to when they are assessing your ability to speak English, not only during role play number 3, but also throughout the rest of the speaking exam. So be very careful about this. In order to make sure that you succeed at this point, it's extremely important that you do not talk fast. You don't have to talk super slowly, but make sure you don't talk fast because that is perceived as a negative aspect of your performance. It's not going to sound good. They are not going to consider this a strength, believe me. So make sure that you speak at a normal pace and make sure that you avoid talking fast. Because when you talk fast, and you have an accent, it makes it harder for people to understand. And the key to complete role play number 3, the key to pass the speaking exam, the CELBAN speaking exam, and any exam actually, is you need to make sure that they can understand you. So here, besides talking at a normal pace, besides avoiding talking fast, you should pay attention to pronunciation and stress and intonation. So be careful because sometimes the students tend to stress the last syllable or rise the intonation at the end of words. So, especially with words that end in on, ion, ty, you know. Um, city, I live in a city. Um, I think that transportation is very important. So make sure that you um, avoid stressing the last syllable. The last syllable of English words, generally speaking, are soft, and don't rise the intonation as well at the end. Okay. The third item is vocabulary, and we talked about how vocabulary is important for completing role play number 3. I emphasized that when I said to you that you need to use different formulas to give advice. So this is extremely important when you complete role play number 3. The fourth criteria used to assess your English speaking skills is fluency. So the less hesitation you make, the better. It's extremely important that you don't make long pauses. Make sure that you complete every single task, including role play number 3. Okay? Now, don't panic if you hesitate a little. Even I hesitate when I speak English. Everybody hesitates. Sometimes we are thinking about what we want to say. So don't overthink. Don't panic if you struggle a little with this item, but try to the best of your ability to make sure that the ideas keep flowing naturally and smoothly. Okay, try to avoid chopping. I want to suggest a piece of advice for you. No, you're chopping. So I would like to suggest, I would like to recommend. See, the words are flowing, and I'm not talking fast, but the words keep flowing in a natural, smooth manner. The sixth item is grammar. The sixth criteria for evaluation is grammar. Of course, you should try to make as few grammar mistakes as possible. Again, don't panic. It's impossible not to make mistakes, but to the best of your ability, try to make as few mistakes as possible. The last criteria is quite important, strategies. This is extremely important, especially when you are doing, when you are working on the role plays 1, 2, and 3. Here, the secret is to make sure that you try to communicate to try to establish some kind of connection with the patient, or in this case, with the nurse who is struggling with a problem. So you need to demonstrate empathy. You need to demonstrate that you care, that you are listening carefully, and that you're trying to help. So you can use strategies like just affirming by saying things like, I see. hmm You can also repeat what the other person said, because when you repeat, you are demonstrating that you were listening, that you're paying attention. Um, and here is extremely important that you use non-verbal communication. to demonstrate caring, empathy, to show that you care. So instead of saying, I'm really sorry to hear that, I can see you are struggling really hard with this problem. You can say, I'm really sorry to hear that. I can see that you are really struggling with this problem. See, by pronouncing, saying certain keywords louder, uh, more, slower, by stretching them, you can better communicate that you care about this fellow nurse who has a serious problem and came to you seeking advice. So, it's pretty simple. This is it. Actually, role play number 3 is one of the easiest, if not the easiest, component of the CELBAN speaking exam. All you have to do is to take these 3 key steps and you're going to do fine. Use different formulas to give advice, provide advice relevant to the situation, and pay attention to the criteria for evaluation. One final recommendation I have for you is stay calm. Keep calm and carry on. Again, you will make mistakes. It's impossible to keep talking for so long without making different kind of mistakes. If you can correct yourself, great, do it. But more importantly is to make sure that you don't allow your nerves to take control of your brain, because when that happens, you cannot think. And when you cannot think, you cannot remember the formulas to give advice. You cannot remember the different pieces of advice I suggested to you here today, and you're gonna get in trouble. So keep calm and carry on despite any mistakes. Thank you so much for sticking with me and listening to this entire presentation on CELBAN Role Play number 3. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something valuable. I really hope this information will assist you in achieving your goal of becoming a nurse here in Canada. I just want one more time to remind you that feedback is extremely important. So now you have all the information and you can practice, 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 which is also extremely necessary and valid. But don't forget that you need someone, a trained coach who can spot the mistakes you are making in terms of pronunciation, grammar, because intelligibility, grammar, these are the two most valuable factors, the key factors they pay attention to when they are assessing your language skills. So if you keep making mistakes with the stress, intonation, grammar, vocabulary usage, your chances of passing the exam diminish. So that's why I insist on getting some help, seeking the help of a professional who can coach you to success. And I would be more than glad to be this person. Thank you very much. Good luck.